On a forgotten desk sat a single sheet of paper with a name written in red, misspelled, imperfect, and impossible to ignore. A quiet clue pointing to a kid from California who would become one of Hollywood's most magnetic figures without ever trying to be shaped by it. But this story doesn't begin with fame. It begins with a different dream entirely. Baseball. A life split between studio contracts and dusty diamonds, until one violent collision at second base erased everything in a single second. And that's where the real question begins. When the dream you truly want is taken from you, and the industry rushes in to define who you're supposed to be, do you accept the label of former child star? Or do you turn loss into legend? Why did he say no when everyone said yes? How did one partnership create timeless icons? And how did a personal choice become the ultimate act of freedom? The answers are hidden in that note, in that collision, and in the past. Because before the legend, there was the diamond, the family, and the first decision that changed everything. To understand Kurt Russell, you have to understand one thing first. Baseball was not a hobby in the Russell house. It was not something Kurt did on weekends between school and television auditions. It was not a casual pastime, a phase, or a backup plan. Baseball was the language his family spoke. It was the table conversation at dinner. The thing his father taught him before he taught him anything else. And the invisible thread that connected every generation of the Russell men before him. And it all started with a man named Bing. Neil Oliver Russell, known to everyone who loved him as Bing, was not just Kurt's father. He was a former professional baseball player, a character actor who spent over a decade as Deputy Clem Foster on one of television's most iconic Western series, Bonanza, and the kind of man who carried the game of baseball in his bones the way other men carried religion. Bing grew up in St. Petersburg, Florida, right near the New York Yankees spring training camp. As a boy, he became an unofficial mascot for the team. Not a fan watching from the stands, a presence, someone the players knew, someone they talked to. He became close friends with Joe DiMaggio, with Lefty Gomez, with legends whose names still echo through baseball history. And one of those connections gave the Russell family something money could never buy: a legacy. Lefty Gomez became something like a godfather to Bing. Stories about the game, about the players, about the way baseball actually worked behind the closed doors of dugouts and spring training camps, they flowed through the Russell household like water. Kurt grew up swimming in them. "My dad gave me technical knowledge," Kurt would later say. "Hearing about baseball from them and other players gave me a strong appreciation from an early age." It wasn't appreciation, it was devotion. From the moment Kurt could grip a bat, Bing was there, hitting grounders to him in the yard, throwing batting practice in the driveway of their home in Thousand Oaks, California, teaching him not just how to hit, but how to think, how to move runners, how to read a play before it unfolded. Baseball, in the Russell house, was serious. It was discussed the way other families discussed dinner plans or weekend trips. It was the thing. And young Kurt absorbed every word. By the time he was 9 years old, baseball had become so central to his life that it shaped a decision that would accidentally change everything. Mickey Mantle and Roger Maris, two of the most legendary names in baseball history, were starring in an upcoming movie called Safe at Home. When Kurt heard about it, the choice was obvious. He auditioned. Not because he wanted to be a movie star, because he wanted to meet Mickey Mantle. He didn't get the part. But the audition opened a door, and through that door came another opportunity. A small, uncredited role in a 1963 Elvis Presley film called It happened at the World's Fair. Kurt was 11 years old. He didn't care much about Elvis, he cared about baseball. But his parents said yes. And Kurt showed up. And something shifted, quietly, in the background of his life, though he would not understand it for years. Because through the 1960s, Kurt Russell played baseball every single chance he got. Little League, all of it. Every season, every game, every dusty afternoon on a diamond somewhere in Southern California. He carried that same hunger into high school, where he played second base for Thousand Oaks High School. He was good. Not good in the way that casual players are good. Good in a way that drew real attention. Good in a way that made people wonder. And through all of it, the school years, the Little League seasons, the high school games, Kurt never once saw baseball as something temporary. He never once looked at the acting roles starting to appear on his resume and thought, maybe that's where this is going. Baseball was where it was going. At least, that was what he believed. Because for Kurt Russell, the diamond was not just a place where he played. It was the place where he felt most like himself. The place where his father's lessons made sense. The place where the Russell name meant something earned, not given. I really loved baseball, Kurt would admit years later, with a weight in his voice that suggested the words didn't come easily. I thought acting was something I could do to make money. It wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I began to take it seriously. Mid-20s. That is when Kurt Russell finally admitted to himself that acting was real, that it mattered, that it might be the thing after all. But that admission didn't come freely. It came because baseball took something from him first, something he never got back. The first time Kurt Russell walked onto a Disney soundstage, he was 15 years old, and the most powerful man in entertainment was watching him. Not from a distance, not through a report on someone's desk, or a recommendation passed along a chain of executives. Walt Disney was there, in person, paying attention, and something in what he saw made him stop. The film was Follow Me, Boys, a family adventure starring the beloved Fred MacMurray. Kurt had a small role. Nothing earth-shattering, nothing that would have turned heads in any ordinary meeting. But Walt Disney was not an ordinary man, and his eye was not an ordinary eye. He saw something in that 15-year-old boy that went beyond talent. He saw a presence, a quality that could not be taught or manufactured or produced by any studio system in the world. And Walt decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent his entire life identifying exactly that kind of quality, that Kurt Russell was worth investing in. So he did something extraordinary. He signed Kurt to a 10-year contract with Walt Disney Productions. Not because the studio needed another child actor, not because the numbers demanded it, because Walt Disney personally believed in this boy. And Walt Disney did not waste his belief. In his final filmed appearance, captured in October of 1966, just weeks before his death, Walt told viewers something that has echoed through Hollywood ever since. He called Kurt Russell a 15-year-old boy for whom I predict a great acting future. Walt Disney, the man who created Mickey Mouse, who built Disneyland with his bare hands and his impossible vision, looked into the camera and made a prophecy about a teenager from Thousand Oaks. And he was right. But the contract and the praise were only the surface of what Walt gave Kurt. What happened beneath that, in the quiet, private hours between them, was something far rarer than a studio deal. It was education. Kurt would later say that Walt Disney reminded him of his grandfather. There was a warmth there, a curiosity, a way of looking at the world that was less about power and more about possibility. Walt had a habit, a defining habit, of asking the same question over and over, no matter what they were discussing. Wouldn't that be fun? That was Walt. Not, would that make money? Not, would that be smart? The question was always about joy, about play, about the purest reason anyone ever makes anything. And he didn't just ask the question. He taught Kurt how to think it. Disney would sit with the young actor and talk about screenplays, about structure, about how a story breathes on the page versus how it breathes on screen, about points of view, about audiences, what they feel, what they need, what they respond to in ways they can't always name. These were not lessons delivered in a classroom. They were conversations, the kind that happen between two people who genuinely enjoy each other's company, where knowledge passes not through instruction, but through presence. He taught me about structure of a screenplay, points of view, audiences, how to look at a character, how to access the believability and credibility, Kurt recalled. They were all things I had never thought about. I really liked him. Walt also gave Kurt something no other studio executive would think to give a teenage contract player: access. He took Kurt on tours of the animation studio, behind the doors that most people, even people who worked at Disney, never saw. He showed him how the magic was actually made. Not the magic of the movies themselves, but the deeper magic, the machinery of imagination. How an idea becomes an image, becomes a story, becomes something that lives in the hearts of millions. And then Walt did something even more remarkable. He showed Kurt an early cut of Mary Poppins, before the film had been released, before the world had seen a single frame. And he watched. Not for Kurt's reaction to the movie, for Kurt's reaction to the craft. Walt Disney used a 15-year-old boy as his personal test audience because something about the way Kurt perceived stories made him trustworthy. He also gave Kurt gifts, pieces of Disney background art, the original painted landscapes that served as the worlds behind the characters. To most people, these were decorative. To Kurt, they were something Walt was saying without words. You matter enough to receive these. Walt even nudged Kurt gently toward acting as a career. At the time, Kurt's heart still belonged to baseball. The diamond still called louder than any soundstage. But Walt, who understood better than almost anyone alive what it meant to build something from a dream, saw in Kurt a gift that baseball, no matter how much the boy loved it, could never fully use. And then, on December 15, 1966, Walt Disney died. Kurt was 15. He was on a soundstage at Universal Studios, filming a Western television show that day, not even a Disney production. He was in the middle of a close-up when the set went quiet. Someone walked over to him. Gently. The way you walk toward someone when the news you carry is heavier than any words you know how to use. I'm sorry to tell you this, Kurt, but Walt Disney died. Kurt has spoken about that moment more than once over the years. The stillness of the set. The way everyone looked at him, not with pity, but with something softer. An awareness that this boy had lost something real. Because he had. He had lost a mentor, a friend, a man who saw him, truly saw him, at an age when most people in his life saw only a child actor doing a job. And years later, when someone showed Kurt that piece of paper on Walt's desk, the note with Kurt Russell scrawled in red grease pencil, one of the last things the man ever wrote, Kurt didn't know what to say. He still doesn't, not entirely, but he knows what it meant. It meant Walt never stopped thinking about him, even at the very end. For a few extraordinary years in the early 1970s, Kurt Russell was living two lives, and he was excelling at both. On one side of his world, there was Disney, the sound stages, the lights, the 10-year contract that Walt himself had signed off on. Films were rolling. The computer wore tennis shoes. Now you see him, now you don't. The barefoot executive. Kurt was becoming Disney's top star of the decade. Robert Osborne, the respected film historian at Turner Classic Movies, would later call him exactly that, the studio's defining live-action presence of the 70s. Audiences loved him. He was charm itself on screen, the all-American kid. Apple pie and ice cream in human form. But on the other side of that same world, the side most people never saw, Kurt Russell was putting on a uniform for a very different reason. He was playing baseball, seriously, professionally, not as a hobby between takes, not as something fun to do on weekends, as a genuine, committed pursuit of the dream he had carried since childhood. In 1971, while still under his Disney contract, Kurt signed with the California Angels minor league system. He was 20 years old, a switch-hitting second baseman. And he was good enough to earn a roster spot on the Bend Rainbows in the Class A Northwest League. Good enough that when the opportunity came to play AAA ball in Mexico City, he had to actually weigh the decision. He chose to stay in the American system instead. Not because Mexico City scared him, but because he believed in the path, the climb, the rainbows, then the Walla Walla Islanders in 1972. Each year, Kurt moved. Each year, the competition got harder. Each year, he kept his place. And then, in 1973, he was promoted to Class AA, the El Paso Sun Kings, the Texas League. This was not small time anymore. This was Kurt Russell, the Disney contract player, genuinely competing at a level that demanded everything from him. Baseball was not a side project. It was a parallel career, running alongside Hollywood with equal weight, equal commitment, equal fire. The two worlds existed side by side, and Kurt kept them separate with a discipline that most people in either industry wouldn't have managed. On set, he was the actor. On the diamond, he was the ball player. And he moved between them with the kind of quiet focus that defines people who are truly driven. Not loud about it, not performative, just relentless. His father, Bing, was part of this world too. Bing owned the Portland Mavericks, the only independent team in the Class A Northwest League. And Kurt would do promotional work for the team during the off-season. Baseball was still the family business. It was still the shared language. And for a brief window of time, it felt like Kurt might actually end up living inside that language forever. Early in the 1973 season with El Paso, Kurt was in the field. A double play was developing. The kind of play that second basemen drill hundreds of times. Catch the ball, turn, throw, the pivot, the motion that separates the good from the great. Kurt was in position. He caught the ball. He turned. And the incoming runner hit him. Not a clean slide. Not the kind of collision that gets brushed off and forgotten by the next inning. A full, hard impact. The kind that happens when a base runner is trying to break up the play. The kind that sends a body flying in a direction it was never meant to go. The collision tore through the rotator cuff in Kurt's right shoulder, his throwing shoulder. The one that mattered most. The damage was immediate. The verdict was not long in coming. Kurt did not return to El Paso. He played a handful of games later that season as a designated hitter for his father's Portland Mavericks, the position that required the least from a broken throwing arm. But the truth was already settled. Everyone around him could see it. Bing could see it. Kurt could feel it in the way the pain wouldn't leave, in the way the arm wouldn't respond the way it once had. Baseball was over. Just like that. Not with a grand farewell. Not with a ceremony or a moment of collective recognition. With a collision at second base during a Tuesday game in the Texas League. 1 second of contact. And the dream that had lived in Kurt Russell since he was 9 years old since the day he auditioned for Safe at Home just to meet Mickey Mantle, was finished. He was 22. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a person when the thing they wanted most is taken away, not by failure, but by accident. Not by a lack of talent or effort or will. By a body that simply couldn't survive the thing it was asked to do. Kurt Russell has never been a man who talks about pain the way some people in Hollywood learn to perform it. He doesn't dramatize. He doesn't dwell. But when he has spoken about this moment, in interviews scattered across decades, the weight is always there. Underneath the ease, underneath the charm, underneath the laugh that comes so naturally. "I really loved baseball," he said once simply, and in those 5 words was everything. Because the man who would become one of Hollywood's most magnetic stars didn't choose this path out of passion. Not at first. He chose it because the other path, the one he actually wanted, was no longer available. What happened next would determine whether that loss became the end of a story or the beginning of a much bigger one. Here is the thing about being a child star that no one tells you until you're already trapped inside it. The audience that loved you at 12 doesn't automatically love you at 22. The studio that made you a household name doesn't automatically know what to do with you when you outgrow the roles that made you famous. And the industry that profited from your childhood doesn't care, not really, whether the adult version of you finds a place in the world. Kurt Russell found this out the hard way. Through the late 1960s and into the early 1970s, he was Disney's golden boy. The kid audiences trusted. The face you put on a movie poster and people showed up. But as the years moved, and Kurt's body changed, and his voice deepened, and the boy on screen became a young man, something uncomfortable began to settle into the air around him. He was stuck. Not stuck in the way that some child stars are stuck. In scandal, in addiction, in the wreckage of a life lived too fast under too much light. Kurt Russell's life was stable. His family was warm. His work was consistent. But his career, the actual shape of it, the kinds of roles that came to him, was frozen in amber. He was still being seen as the kid, the wholesome Disney boy, apple pie, ice cream, safe. And Kurt Russell was not safe. He had never been safe. Not really. He just hadn't had the chance to prove it. "It was great to be a part of Disney, and I'll always be thankful for that," he said in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter. "But I wanted to prove that I could do more. I wanted to break out of the mold and show that I could handle more serious, adult roles." The problem was that Hollywood is not an industry that rewards wanting. It rewards proving. And proving, when you are a former child star with a decade of family films behind your name, is one of the hardest things in the world to do. Kurt tried, quietly, persistently, the way he does everything. In 1975, he took on a role in The Deadly Tower, a television movie about Charles Whitman, the man responsible for the Texas Tower shooting of 1966. It was dark. It was serious. It was about as far from Disney as you could travel in a single casting decision. Some critics noticed. Some doors cracked open. But the industry moved slowly, and the whisper around Kurt Russell remained the same. That Disney kid. And then came Elvis. In 1979, John Carpenter, a director whose instincts for casting were as sharp as his instincts for horror, offered Kurt the title role in a television biopic about Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, the most charismatic performer in the history of American music. It was an audacious choice, a polarizing one. The reaction was immediate, and it was brutal. The press didn't just question the casting. They mocked it. Openly, loudly. The kind of ridicule that fills newspapers and talk shows and the conversations of people who decide, collectively, whether someone deserves a chance before they've even had one. When I did Elvis, I went through about a 6-month period of listening to the world. Anybody that had any inclination to write anything about the upcoming Elvis biopic, they were just having a field day, Kurt recalled. Like, oh my God, you gotta be kidding me. That Disney actor, that Disney guy. They couldn't come up with enough put-downs. Kurt felt the sting. He was human. He wasn't above the weight of being publicly dismissed. But something in him shifted. Not into doubt, but into something harder. Something sharper. At first, I kind of went, oh yeah? Whatever. Then I went, you know? Fuck them. And then I went, oh, wait a minute. Bring it on, boys. Bring it on. Because it really does give me nowhere to go but up. And then I thought, I'll be good at this. I know that. I know I'm going to do a good job here. And at that point, they owe me an apology. He was right. Elvis was extraordinary. Not good, not competent, not passable. Extraordinary. Kurt didn't approximate the king. He inhabited him. The physicality, the charisma, the danger underneath the charm. He spent months studying Elvis, not just watching footage, but listening to the world around Elvis, understanding the gravitational pull that made people fall toward him. When he played Elvis, he wasn't acting, he was being. And the full circle of it, the painful, almost mythic symmetry, was not lost on anyone who paid attention. Because the very first time Kurt Russell had appeared on screen, as a child of 11, he had been in a movie with the real Elvis Presley. It happened at the World's Fair, 1963. Kurt's job in that scene was simple. He kicked Elvis in the leg. A boy kicking the king. 16 years later, that same boy was the king. The performance earned Kurt a Primetime Emmy nomination for Outstanding Lead Actor. The critics who had spent months tearing him apart before a single frame was shot went quiet. The doors that had stayed closed for years didn't crack open. They blew off their hinges. And standing on the other side of them was not just a new chapter in Kurt Russell's career. It was the beginning of something much larger. A partnership with the director who had seen what no one else bothered to look for. John Carpenter had found his leading man. John Carpenter did not stumble into Kurt Russell. He chose him. Deliberately. With the kind of certainty that only comes from a director who knows exactly what he needs and has spent years waiting for the right person to fill the space. Elvis had been their first collaboration. Carpenter directing, Russell starring. And something had clicked between them that went beyond the mechanics of filmmaking. Carpenter saw in Kurt a quality that the rest of Hollywood had spent a decade trying to sand down. A roughness, an edge, a way of inhabiting a screen that made you lean forward without knowing why. So when Carpenter began developing Escape from New York, a post-apocalyptic action film set in a future where Manhattan has become a maximum security prison and one man has to go in to rescue the President of the United States, there was only one person he wanted playing the lead. And that person was not a hero. Snake Plissken. Say the name to anyone who grew up watching movies in the 1980s, and something happens. A flicker of recognition. A shift in posture. The image of a man with an eye patch, a leather jacket, and an expression that communicated, without a single word, that he did not care about your rules, your authority, or your survival. Snake Plissken was not a hero. He was a criminal, a convict, a man who had been thrown into the same prison he was now being asked to infiltrate. He didn't save people out of goodness. He saved them because he had to. because his own life depended on it. And when the mission was done, he didn't celebrate. He walked away. And Kurt Russell played him like he had been waiting his entire life to. Escape from New York came out in 1981, and it did something rare in Hollywood. It didn't just succeed. It created a type, an archetype, the cynical, self-interested, impossibly cool anti-hero who operates entirely outside the system and feels no guilt about it. Before Kurt Russell was Snake Plissken, that character didn't fully exist on screen. After him, everyone was trying to copy it. But nobody could, because Snake Plissken wasn't just cool, he was alive. Kurt brought a physicality to the role, a dry wit, a barely contained danger that made the character feel real in a way that Hollywood archetypes rarely do. Carpenter had written the part with a specific kind of man in mind. Not a tough guy performing toughness, but someone who carried it naturally, the way some people carry height or stillness. Kurt carried it. The partnership deepened immediately. In 1982, Carpenter brought Kurt back for The Thing, a science fiction horror film about an alien organism that could perfectly imitate any living creature, trapped on an isolated Antarctic research station. It was darker than Escape from New York, quieter, more psychological. The horror wasn't in spectacle. It was in trust, in not knowing which of the men around you was still human. Kurt played R.J. MacReady, the station's helicopter pilot, the one person whose paranoia turns out to be completely justified. It was a different kind of role than Snake Plissken. Less swagger, more endurance. The kind of performance that doesn't demand attention but commands it. And The Thing, despite being largely misunderstood by audiences and critics at the time of its release, became one of the most celebrated horror films ever made. Over the decades, it climbed onto every serious list of the genre's greatest achievements. Kurt was at the center of it. Then came Big Trouble in Little China in 1986. And here, Carpenter did something almost playful, something that revealed how deep his understanding of Kurt actually went. He wrote Kurt a character who was, on the surface, the leading man, the big talker, the confident one who struts into the room like he owns it, but wasn't. Jack Burton was not the hero of Big Trouble in Little China. He thought he was. He behaved like he was. But the actual hero, the one who understood the situation, who made the real decisions, who saved the day, was his quieter, more observant friend, played by Dennis Dunn. It was a subversive choice, a joke wrapped inside an action film, and Kurt played it brilliantly. With enough self-awareness to make the comedy work, and enough genuine charisma to make you enjoy watching a man who is, essentially, the sidekick the entire time. Carpenter understood something about Kurt that the rest of Hollywood hadn't figured out yet. Kurt didn't need to be the biggest thing in every room. He was magnetic enough that even when the story wasn't built around him, he held it together through presence alone. The Carpenter-Russell films, Escape from New York, The Thing, Big Trouble in Little China, were not just movies. They were a vocabulary, a shared language between a director and an actor who understood each other in a way that rarely happens in an industry built on transactions. And Snake Plissken, that scarred, indifferent, magnificently selfish survivor, became something Kurt Russell carried with him long after the cameras stopped rolling. Not a role, a legend. The first time Kurt Russell and Goldie Hawn were in the same room, he was 15 years old and she was 20. It was 1966. The film was the one and only genuine original family band, a Disney musical that would quietly disappear into history. Neither of them would remember much about the movie itself, but Goldie would remember Kurt. I was 21 and he was 16. "And I thought he was adorable," she said years later, with the kind of laugh that belongs to someone recounting the beginning of something she didn't yet understand. But he was much too young. She was right. He was too young. And so they went their separate ways. Two people who had shared a set, shared a brief window of each other's attention, and then drifted back into the enormous, churning current of Hollywood, where thousands of lives cross and almost none of them stick. For 17 years, nothing happened. And then, in 1983, everything did. Kurt was auditioning for Swing Shift, Jonathan Demme's romantic comedy. Goldie was already attached to star, and when Kurt walked into the room, something clicked. Not the easy, effortless click that movies like to pretend love is. Something more interesting than that. A recognition. The kind that happens when two people who have already, somewhere in the past, registered each other as important, finally meet again at the right moment in their lives. Kurt, by his own admission, made a mistake almost immediately. He said something about Goldie that, by any normal standard of professional behavior, he shouldn't have said. Something about her figure, something that, in the wrong hands, would have ended the conversation before it began. But Goldie wasn't offended. She was flattered. Their first date followed shortly after, and it was not a dinner at a nice restaurant or a quiet walk through Los Angeles. It was Kurt helping Goldie break into a house she was renovating. The lock was stuck. The door wouldn't open. And Kurt, without making a production of it, found a way in. They fell in love during the filming of Swing Shift. Not slowly, not in the way that Hollywood romances are usually narrated, with grand gestures and declarations and the kind of drama that makes for good publicity. They fell in love the way two people fall in love when they are both, for the first time in a long time, feeling genuinely safe. Because neither of them had been safe recently. Goldie had just come out of a painful divorce from Bill Hudson, the father of her two children, Oliver and Kate. Kurt had recently ended his marriage to Susan Hubley, with whom he shared a son, Boston. Both of them carried the scars of relationships that hadn't worked. Both of them understood, in their bones, what it felt like when love became something other than love. And so, when they found each other, they made a decision that Hollywood has never quite forgiven them for. They didn't get married. Not then, not ever. It was not an oversight. It was not indifference. It was a choice, deliberate, considered, and deeply personal, that they made together and have defended, with quiet conviction, for over 40 years. A lasting relationship isn't about marriage, Goldie explained. It's about compatibility and communication, and you both need to want it to work. Kurt said it differently, but with the same clarity. For people like us, the marriage certificate wasn't going to create anything that otherwise we wouldn't have. They had both seen what marriage could become when it stopped working. They had both lived through the wreckage, and they decided, together, that what they had was too important to put inside a structure that could be broken by a court order. Instead, they chose each other, every day, actively, without the safety net of a legal obligation. "I would have been long divorced if I ever married Kurt," Goldie said once on a British talk show, with a smile that carried decades of meaning. There's something psychological about not being married. If you have independence, if you have enough sense of independence, you wake up every morning and you make the decision to be together. That's more powerful than any piece of paper. And what made this decision remarkable, what made it more than just a headline or a conversation piece, was what it looked like in practice. It looked like this. When Goldie's children, Oliver and Kate, first spent time around Kurt, they were young. Goldie watched, carefully, the way any mother watches when a new person enters the lives of her kids. She watched how Kurt spoke to them, how he listened, how he moved through the room when they were in it. What really got me was when I watched my kids when they'd come to the set and how he was with them, she told People. He was amazing with them. He was such a natural. Kurt didn't try to replace their father. He didn't compete. He simply showed up, consistently, reliably, warmly, and became something that Oliver and Kate needed and didn't always have. A presence, a safe place, a man who was there. Kate Hudson, who grew up to become one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses in her own right, has spoken about Kurt with a reverence that goes far beyond gratitude. I have a stepfather who stepped in and played a huge part in sharing what it is to have a dependable father figure in our life, she said. She called Kurt her loyal protector, a wild and sometimes untamed adventurer father, not a stepfather performing a role, a father. Full stop. In 1986, Kurt and Goldie welcomed their own son together, Wyatt, and the family they built around him was not a Hollywood family in the way that phrase usually sounds. It was a blended family, yes. It was complicated on paper, yes. But in the rooms where it lived, in the homes in California and Colorado where they raised their children, it was simply a family, loud and warm, and full of baseball and hockey and laughter and the kind of chaos that only happens when people genuinely enjoy being around each other. Kurt and Goldie didn't break the rules of Hollywood romance because they wanted attention for it. They broke them because the rules were wrong. And 40 years later, the proof is in the way they still look at each other. There is a version of Kurt Russell that Hollywood sells. The action star, the anti-hero, the man with the eye patch and the leather jacket who doesn't answer to anyone. Snake Plissken, Jack Burton, the guy who walks into a burning building or a dying spaceship and somehow comes out the other side looking like he was made for exactly that kind of chaos. And that version is real. It's part of him. But it is not the whole story. Not even close. The whole story lives in the quieter rooms, in the way Kurt Russell moves through his own house when his children are in it, in the contracts he negotiated, not for more money, not for better billing, but for the right to fly home every single night from a desert shoot, no matter how far, so he could be there when his kids went to sleep. Kurt Russell is, by every account from every person who has watched him do it, one of the finest fathers in Hollywood. And he built that reputation not through grand declarations or public performances of fatherhood. He built it through showing up, day after day, year after year, in the small, unglamorous, irreplaceable ways that children actually notice. It started with Boston. Boston Oliver Grant Russell was born in 1980, during Kurt's marriage to Susan Hubley. When Kurt and Susan divorced in 1983, Boston was 3 years old. And from that moment forward, Kurt made a decision that would quietly define the rest of his life as a father. He stayed present. Not in the way that absent fathers promise to stay present. In the way that fathers who actually do it stay present, consistently, without drama, without making it about themselves. Boston grew up to be almost the exact opposite of what Hollywood would predict for the son of a movie star. He stayed out of the spotlight entirely. No acting career, no public life, no capitalizing on the name. Instead, he pursued something that surprised even those closest to the family. He became a religious scholar, a master's degree in Buddhist theology, a minor in Hinduism, a psychology degree after that. His brother Wyatt spoke about him once with unmistakable pride. "My brother Boston is a religious scholar. That's what I like to consider as true things to be proud of, to celebrate." Boston chose his own path, quietly, completely, and The fact that he felt free enough to do that, free enough to walk away from a world that would have opened every door for him simply because of his last name, says something about how Kurt raised him. He didn't raise a boy who needed fame to feel like enough. He raised a man who already knew he was. Then there were Oliver and Kate. Oliver Hudson and Kate Hudson, Goldie's children from her marriage to Bill Hudson, were young when Kurt entered their lives. Oliver was 7. Kate was 4. And the relationship that formed between them and Kurt was not the relationship that blended families usually produce. It was not awkward. It was not provisional. It was not the kind of thing that requires asterisks or footnotes. It was love, simply, entirely. Kate has been the most public about it. In interview after interview, across years of her own career, which has taken her from almost famous to romantic comedies to music, she has returned to Kurt again and again, with a clarity that suggests she has thought about this more than she has ever said. I have a stepfather who stepped in and played a huge, huge part in sharing what it is to have a dependable father figure in our life, she said once, speaking to Howard Stern. I think that people can do a lot of things, and they can be very successful, and they can still be a really good parent, because I was raised that way. She called Kurt her loyal protector, a wild and sometimes untamed adventurer father. Not a stepfather performing duty. A father. The real kind. The kind that shows up at every game, reads every bedtime story, and is there in the morning without being asked. Oliver, too, has carried Kurt's influence quietly through his life. An actor himself now, with hundreds of television credits, but someone who learned from watching Kurt that the work is separate from the man. That what you do on screen doesn't have to be what you are when you come home. And then there is Wyatt. Wyatt Hawn Russell, born in 1986, the only biological child Kurt and Goldie share, is, in many ways, the most striking mirror of his father's life. Because Wyatt's story runs almost exactly parallel to Kurt's, he was a serious athlete first, an ice hockey goaltender, not casually, not as a hobby, but as a committed professional pursuit. He played junior hockey, college hockey, professional hockey in Europe, in Germany, in the Netherlands. Hockey was Wyatt's baseball. It was his dream, his identity, the thing he built himself around. And then, like Kurt, an injury ended it. A hip injury at 24. Not a choice. Not a gradual fade. A door closing. And Wyatt did exactly what his father had done. He turned to acting. And he became extraordinary at it. The Marvel Cinematic Universe. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. Monarch. Legacy of Monsters, where Wyatt and Kurt played the same character in different time periods. A father and son on screen portraying the same man across decades. We've never been people who go for low-hanging fruit, Wyatt said, talking about the decision to take that role together. It's just never been interesting. We always asked, what's the hardest thing you can do? That question, what's the hardest thing you can do, was not something Wyatt invented. He learned it from watching his father live it. Kurt Russell did not raise 4 children the way Hollywood raises children. He didn't raise performers. He didn't raise brand extensions. He raised people. Complicated, independent, fiercely alive people who carry his name or his influence into their lives the way you carry something precious. Not because it was given to them, because it was earned. In every quiet room, every flight home from the desert, every morning he was there before they opened their eyes. Every great man can trace the architecture of who he is back to one person. For Kurt Russell, that person was not Walt Disney. It was not John Carpenter. It was not Goldie Hawn. It was not any director. any producer, any studio executive who ever handed him a role or signed him a check. It was Bing. Neil Oliver Russell, the man the world knew as Deputy Clem Foster on Bonanza, the man baseball fans in Portland knew as the owner of the Mavericks, the man his family knew simply as Dad, was the foundation upon which everything Kurt Russell became was built. Remove Bing from the equation, and Kurt Russell, as we know him, does not exist. Not the actor, not the father, not the man. Because Bing Russell was not just someone who loved baseball, he was someone who understood, in a way that very few people in any field ever truly understand, what it means to give a person one last chance. The Portland Mavericks were proof of that understanding made real. When Bing bought the team in 1973, he didn't build it like other minor league owners built theirs. He didn't chase wins, though the Mavericks won. He didn't chase sponsorship deals. He kept corporate logos off the park entirely. He didn't chase efficiency or profit or any of the metrics that professional sports organizations use to measure success. He chased something else: fun. That was his motto. Not win. Fun. One word. 3 letters. And it changed everything about how the team operated, how it was perceived, and who it attracted. Bing kept a 30-man roster, far larger than teams typically maintained, because he believed that some of the players on that roster deserved one more season, one more chance, one more summer on a diamond before the game ended for them, ex-major leaguers who had never quite made it, veterans on the edge of retirement who weren't ready to stop, dreamers who had come from halfway across the world, from France, from Cape Town, just for the chance to play. And Bing let them. He hired the first female general manager in the history of professional baseball, Lanny Moss. He hired the first Asian American general manager and manager the following year. He held open tryouts. Anyone who showed up could audition for a roster spot. The gates were open. The philosophy was radical, and it was simple. Everyone deserves a chance to play. The Mavericks set a record for the highest attendance in minor league baseball history. Not because of the wins, because of what the team represented. A place where the game was still about something pure. Kurt played for his father's team, briefly, late in 1977, already past his own playing days, doing it as a favor because Bing sensed it might be the team's last season. "My dad won't ask," a sports writer told Kurt, "but I will." Kurt showed up. He suited up. He played. Because that was what you did in the Russell family. You showed up. And then there was the moment that no one who heard it has ever forgotten. In 1979, Carpenter's television film Elvis brought Kurt and Bing together on screen in a way that felt less like casting and more like fate. Kurt played Elvis Presley, and Bing played Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. Father and son, playing father and son. It was not planned as a statement. It was not orchestrated for sentiment. But it was, quietly, one of the most intimate things the Russell family ever shared with the public. 2 men who loved each other and loved baseball and loved the strange, winding road that life had taken them down, standing together under studio lights, pretending to be 2 other men who had loved each other just as much. The real Elvis had met Bing years earlier, on the set of It Happened at the World's Fair, when Kurt was just 11. Elvis had spotted Bing across the soundstage and asked Kurt to introduce them. And after they met, Elvis asked Bing a question that surprised everyone in the room. "I've seen you in a lot of westerns," Elvis said. "I love the way you wear your hat. If I ever do a western, would it be okay if I wore my hat that way?" Bing said yes, and he felt honored. That was who Bing was, a man who made other people feel seen, a man who gave permission freely, a man whose presence in a room made everyone in it feel like they mattered a little more than they had before he walked in. He died on April 8, 2003, cancer, in Thousand Oaks, California, the same town where he had raised Kurt, where the family had lived, where the sound of a bat hitting a ball in the driveway had been the soundtrack of childhood. He was 76. Kurt has never spoken publicly about his father's death in the way that celebrities are sometimes expected to, with long interviews and tearful confessions and carefully crafted statements designed to let the world in. He has carried it the way he carries most things. Quietly. Privately. The way Bing himself would have wanted. But the weight of it is visible if you know where to look. In the way Kurt fathers his own children. In the way he shows up. In the contracts he negotiates to fly home every night. In the open tryouts he holds in his own life. The chances he gives. The doors he leaves unlocked. The philosophy that runs underneath everything he does. Fun, not win. Fun. Bing Russell didn't leave Kurt a fortune. He didn't leave him a dynasty. He left him something harder to inherit and more difficult to replicate. He left him a way of being in the world. And Kurt Russell, every single day, is still playing by it. There is a kind of rebellion that Hollywood understands, the kind that makes headlines, the kind that burns bright and fast and leaves wreckage in its wake. The actor who destroys the system from the inside, the star who implodes publicly, spectacularly, in a way that everyone watches and no one can look away from. Kurt Russell has never been that. His rebellion is quieter, slower, almost invisible to anyone who isn't paying close attention. And because of that, it is far more effective than anything loud could ever be. It started with the roles he said no to. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Kurt Russell was one of the most bankable names in Hollywood. Tango and Cash had been a box office hit, despite terrible reviews. Backdraft had earned over $150 million worldwide. Tombstone, his portrayal of Wyatt Earp, had become one of the most beloved westerns in American cinema. Studios wanted him. Everywhere. All the time. And Kurt said no. Not to everything, but to most of it. He became extraordinarily selective. Not in the way that actors become selective when they are trying to seem important, but in the way that someone becomes selective when they have genuinely decided that their time matters more than their resume. I became even more selective in the roles I took, he said simply. Only those parts that interested me. Wait, that sentence contains an entire philosophy. Interested him. Not parts that paid well. Not parts that would keep his name visible. Not parts that agents and studios recommended because they fit a market or filled a schedule. Parts that interested him. It was radical. In Hollywood, where the machinery runs on visibility and momentum and the constant fear that if you disappear even briefly the world will forget you ever existed, Kurt Russell chose to disappear. Regularly. Willingly. Sometimes for years at a time. And he came back stronger every time. Because the thing Hollywood doesn't want you to understand, the thing that threatens the entire system if too many people figure it out, is that absence creates desire. That scarcity is more powerful than presence. That the actor who is always available, always on screen, always performing, becomes wallpaper. And the actor who shows up only when he has something genuinely worth showing, that actor becomes an event. Kurt understood this before most people in the industry even thought to ask the question. But the rebellion went deeper than career strategy. Kurt Russell is a licensed pilot. He has been for years. He flies his own plane. He has used that skill not just for travel, not just for the freedom that comes from being able to move through the sky on your own terms, but for something more grounded and more meaningful. He has assisted in real search and rescue missions. He has flown toward danger when others would fly away from it. Not because it was required of him, not because a studio demanded it, but because the sky asked him to, and he answered. There is something in that detail, something small and easily overlooked, that reveals everything about who Kurt Russell actually is underneath the screen persona. He does things because they matter, not because they are watched, not because they make good publicity, because they are the right thing to do, and he is the kind of man who does them anyway. He doesn't need the world to witness his goodness to perform it, and that extends to how he has handled fame itself. Hollywood tells its stars a story. The story goes like this: you owe us everything. Your face is our product. Your presence is our currency. You must be visible, available, grateful, and perpetually performing, not just on screen, but in every public moment of your life. Interviews, red carpets, social media. The machine never stops, and if you step off it, you disappear. Kurt Russell stepped off it, repeatedly, deliberately, without apology. He spent more time in the early 2000s focused on family than on film. He took long stretches away from the camera. He made films nobody expected him to make, and skipped the ones everybody told him to take. He traveled, he flew, he lived. In Colorado, in California, in the quiet spaces between productions where most actors go mad from stillness, and Kurt Russell simply breathes. "Movies are only a part of your life," he said once, in an interview that revealed more in a single sentence than most actors reveal in entire autobiographies. Baseball is the complete experience. I've probably had those times in my personal life. I've probably felt that way with Goldie. Baseball, the complete experience. Even now, decades after the injury, after the diamond, after the minor leagues, and the dream that was taken from him in a single collision at second base in El Paso, Texas, in 1973, baseball is still the thing Kurt Russell measures everything against. Not as a career, not as a loss, as a standard, as the purest form of what it means to be fully alive in something. And he has spent his entire adult life searching for that feeling in other places. In acting, sometimes. In fatherhood, always. In flying. In the quiet mornings when no one is watching and the world doesn't need anything from him, and he is just Kurt. Just a man. Just alive. That is the rebellion. Not loud, not destructive, not the kind that makes people gasp or reach for their phones to document the spectacle. The kind that simply refuses to become what someone else needs you to be. The kind that, in the end, wins. In 2017, Kurt Russell received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. He was 66 years old. He had been on screen for over 50 years. And when he pressed his hand into the wet cement, that small, ancient ritual that Hollywood invented to make fame feel permanent, something about the moment felt less like an ending and more like a quiet acknowledgement. Not of everything he had done, of everything he had survived doing it on his own terms. Because by the time that star was placed on the sidewalk, Kurt Russell had already become something Hollywood rarely produces. He had become genuinely irreplaceable. Not because he was the biggest star, not because he had the most franchises or the highest paycheck, but because there was no one else who could do what he did, the way he did it, and the industry had finally, after decades, admitted it. The proof was in the work of his final years. Quentin Tarantino saw it first. Tarantino, like Carpenter before him, is a director who collects actors the way other people collect art. He doesn't cast for convenience, he casts for obsession. And his obsession with Kurt Russell produced 3 collaborations that span nearly 2 decades and reveal different dimensions of the man each time. Death Proof, in 2007, was the first. Kurt played stuntman Mike, a serial killer who uses his car as a weapon. It was grotesque. It was entertaining. It was the kind of role that lesser actors would have played for shock value. Kurt played it with genuine menace, the kind that makes your skin crawl not because of what's happening on screen, but because of what you sense underneath the performance. Something real. Something controlled. Something that made you believe, for the length of the film, that this man was actually dangerous. Then, The Hateful Eight, in 2015. A Western, Tarantino's love letter to the genre that had shaped Kurt since childhood, since Bing, since Bonanza, since the dusty sound stages where the Russell family first made its name. Kurt played General Sandy Smithers, a man carrying grief and rage in equal measure, wound tight enough to explode. It was a quieter performance than stuntman Mike, but in many ways, more devastating. The kind of role that reminds you why Kurt Russell has lasted when so many others haven't. Because he can do small, he can do restrained, he can fill silence with more weight than most actors fill with dialogue. And then, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, in 2019, Tarantino's final statement on the industry he loves. Kurt was there, at the edges, doing what Kurt does best when he isn't the center of attention, holding the frame together simply by being in it. But Tarantino was not the only director who understood what Kurt had become. James Gunn saw it too. In Guardians of the Galaxy Vol. 2, released in 2017, Kurt played Ego, a living planet, a god in the mythology of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Kurt's father in the story was Peter Quill, played by Chris Pratt, and the role required something unusual, charm that conceals darkness, warmth that is, ultimately, a mask. Kurt played it with devastating ease, because he had spent his entire career learning exactly how to make an audience trust him. And here, for the first time, he turned that trust into something sinister. It was one of the most unsettling villain performances in Marvel Cinematic Universe history, and audiences loved it. Then came something no one expected. Santa Claus, The Christmas Chronicles, on Netflix in 2018. Kurt Russell playing the most beloved figure in holiday folklore, not with irony, not with wink and nudge self-awareness, but with genuine warmth, with joy, with the kind of presence that made children believe, for the length of that film, that the man on screen was actually magic. It was, in its own quiet way, one of the most revealing things Kurt Russell has ever done on camera. Because it showed the thing that Snake Plissken and stuntman Mike and Ego could never show on their own. That underneath all of it, the leather and the eye patch and the danger, Kurt Russell is a man who genuinely likes making people happy. And then, most recently, came the project that brought him full circle in a way that felt almost too perfect to be real. The Madison, a Yellowstone spin-off, created by Taylor Sheridan, starring Michelle Pfeiffer. Kurt was cast as Preston Clyburn, the patriarch of a family navigating grief and reinvention in the mountains of Montana. A neo-Western, a family drama, a story about what remains when everything you built is shaken to its foundations. Kurt called it extremely well written. He said it was really fun to do. And the way he said it, not with the measured enthusiasm of an actor promoting a project, but with the simple honesty of a man who genuinely enjoyed his time on set, said everything. Fun. The word kept coming back. Bing's word. The Maverick's word. The philosophy that had run underneath Kurt Russell's entire life, like a current beneath still water. His fortune, by most estimates, sits somewhere around $100 million. Enough to stop working. Enough to disappear entirely into the life he has built with Goldie. The homes in California and Colorado, the ranch, the quiet mornings, the wine he has come to love on family trips, the grandchildren now arriving in the next generation of a family that has, against every odd Hollywood stacks against it, held together. But he hasn't stopped. Not because he needs the money, not because he needs the attention, because the work still interests him, because there are still roles that make him lean forward, the way he leaned forward in that baseball dugout 50 years ago when a pitch came in that he hadn't seen before. And that is, perhaps, the truest thing about Kurt Russell. He is still the boy with two dreams. One of them was taken from him on a baseball diamond in El Paso, Texas, in 1973, and he grieved it, quietly, the way he grieves everything, privately, completely, and without burdening anyone else with the weight. But the other dream, the one Walt Disney saw in him before anyone else did, the one that grew from a boy who just wanted to meet Mickey Mantle into a man who became a legend on his own terms, that dream is still alive. It lives in every role he chooses, every flight he takes, every morning he wakes up beside the woman he chose and keeps choosing, and will keep choosing for as long as the choice is his to make. Kurt Russell did not conquer Hollywood. He did something harder. He walked through it without letting it change who he was. If this story made you see him differently, if Snake Plissken meant something to you, if Tombstone ever made your heart race, if the man behind the myth made you believe that it's possible to be a star and still be a human being, subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, the greatest rebellion isn't burning the world down. It's refusing to let the world tell you who you are. Kurt Russell learned that at 9 years old, on a baseball diamond, in a house where the family business was the game. And he has been living it ever since.